Welcome to the Beyond Body podcast with your hosts, Mia and Holly. Join us for a sometimes fortnightly podcast
where we explore all things mental health, being a messy human, and how to get the most out of this one precious life.
and all the ridiculous stories in between.
Welcome back to another Beyond Body podcast. It feels like a while.
It feels like it because it has been.
Because it has been a while. You'll notice in our little intro we say sometimes fortnightly for this reason, because the gals get busy.
That's right. I will take the hit for the majority of this. There has been a lot happening behind the scenes, which I shared in a recent YouTube video with like changes to the business and someone coming on to support us, which initially you need to like train that person to then make the business run efficiently. So that efficiency is coming, but at the moment it's more about like investing the time to make sure they're trained up so that all of this stuff, particularly our wonderful podcast, will be a little closer to that fortnightly goal that we have.
We're getting there, guys. And we also know that you can't achieve all your goals at once. So we're a testament to that.
Yeah, we're practicing self-compassion.
We're practicing slowness and patience is what we're doing.
Or like just excuse making, maybe.
So we're in for a real juicy conversation today.
Yes.
I think if my nervous system gets a bit activated when I'm thinking about a podcast episode topic, it's probably going to be a little bit of an opinionated discussion.
Yeah, when I start typing up my notes and my fingers are just like ahead of my brain by about 10 seconds, I'm like, oh, I have more opinions about this than I probably even realized. But as you said, the power of editing, we'll say what we've got to say and then we'll see what stays in.
You realize your notes is all in that caps lock?
Yeah. And like angry emojis.
So guys, today we're going to be talking about social media eating disorder correlations. We're absolutely going to be highlighting some positive things because there is heaps of positive things to highlight. We will also be dissecting the absolutely toxic. It is a wild, wild world out there, folks.
Yep. 100%. And, obviously, I always like to give the disclaimer that, yes, like I've been in the online space for 10 years. I was somebody who was talking about their recovery 10 years ago. So I do feel like there's a few different perspectives that we've got to take into account here. And I also can put my hand up and say, like, I have contributed to this space in that I documented my recovery to an extent. But I think that there are just some considerations to take into account, particularly if you are someone navigating your own recovery in the social media space. And by that, I mean a consumer or a creator, because let's face it, it would be nigh on impossible to remove social media from your life. So is it really possible to remove it from your recovery process in any real capacity? So I think there's a few things that we can unpack today.
I think this is why you're such an interesting case study, because you can really look at this from personal experience from all angles. Like you were someone that recovered by posting things online. You're also now a professional in the space and sort of like have this extra set of eyes to oversee what's actually going on now. Because also over 10 years, like when you first started posting your YouTube videos, it was a very different world digitally than it is now.
Like Instagram was launched after I started my YouTube.
Yeah.
Like the word influencer, this is the context that's so important, not just for everyone else, but for me to accept that I'm now 36 years of age, because it like the word influencer didn't exist. Like it didn't exist in the dictionary. I think it was like a couple of years after I started my YouTube account. Influencer was like the Oxford Dictionary word of the year. So it was a very, very different realm, a very different space. And it was, as far as like even recovery spaces, there weren't a lot of them, and they were very, very like small and weren't very far reaching. But like even without Instagram, it was pretty much unheard of.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think so. Today we're going to be really talking about a whole lot of like digital literacy, misinformation, the general noise of the world, some of diet cultures, masks, and just, genuinely like the rise of influencers, but also activists. And I guess kind of how you protect your recovery through it all.
Yes, most importantly.
So should we start by talking about some of the benefits of being able to access recovery content?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's many. I mean, I'm asked this quite a bit when like I'm interviewed or, it comes up in client, like I'm asked this question all the time, like, do you think it's good or it's bad? And my answer is yes. Like it's both, obviously. Everything is a bit gray
Mm,
and a bit nuanced. And I think particularly in the recovery space, you and I talk about this a lot, that we get very, very black and white. We forget nuance, we forget gray, we forget the individual, we forget like different approaches, different ways of thinking, etc. Of course, there are benefits to being able to access recovery information, inspiration, examples. Um, so, yeah, I think that being able to, even first and foremost, be able to seek out language and an understanding of what might be going on with you is so important, and is a gap that social media has really filled, where you see
mm,
someone else talking about your experience and you go, oh my God, that's me. That's me. I didn't have that. I called the Butterfly Foundation on the first day of my recovery,
wow.
and they gave me language. They were the first ones before my
Mm,
GP to be like, this is what you're describing is an eating disorder, and there is a way to get help. And I was so resistant to that. If anyone watches my first videos, I don't use the words eating disorder for like the first 6 months very often, because I'm like, no, I don't have an eating disorder. I don't fit that stereotype. That
interesting.
doesn't, label doesn't apply. So being able to find language and being able to even just observe how other people talk about these things and what they describe, I think can be a really, really powerful entry point for people to start kind of the acceptance process, and even the kind of like eating disorder or disordered eating, like literacy process, like learning
Mm.
what this might look like and what might be going on without the pressure of like having to go to an appointment or having to tell somebody initially. You can just start to get familiar with what might be going on with you.
Yeah, and I think just on that language point, you could probably do like psychology sessions for 12 months before you're then sort of like introduced and exposed to the language and all these things. Whereas opposed to, you're so right. I actually don't feel like everyone who has a device and is going through recovery, I'd be very surprised if we had like more than 3 people who didn't engage with social media in there during their recovery at all. So it is very much about not trying to avoid it, because we can't avoid it, but how do we actually use this as a positive thing? And it's like everything in life, that there can be a dark side and there can be a light side to it. So it's obviously, yes, we can talk about the content of it, but there also needs to be this level of self-responsibility for how are you actually absorbing that content,
Yes.
and what lenses are you looking at the content through as well. So that's something we can also talk about today.
Yeah. What are some of the benefits, like either from your own experience or just like what you've
Mm,
observed as far as like even clients having positive experiences?
mm.
What do you think some of those benefits are that are out there?
There are so many, particularly I think community is going to be a huge one.
Yeah.
Connection, just generally, like you were saying, this widespread of positive information. Even things like feeling less isolated, feeling seen and understood for the first time. So many free resources that may not be available to someone for financial reasons or other blockages to stop them from actually getting treatment. I also think it's maybe one of the biggest things is like it's inspiration, it's motivation as well. There is so much good that has come from the rise of social media across so many areas. And I think a lot of those areas are very intertwined with recovery world and recovery content. Because,
Mm,
even the increase of social media over the last 10 years, this was really the beginning of a widespread wave of things like body positivity and fat
yes.
and trans activism as
Yeah.
well. I think I guess it's the new age method of just sharing our voices and opinions and identity, and even our care as human beings as well. It really also is, I think this is definitely something that it does for me, like it sparks creativity,
Mm,
and we can get some of these really, really important messages being spread globally. Like ultimately it just gives everyone a voice, everyone.
yeah.
So, and it's so interesting kind of reflecting on it, because it's no longer just sort of like big media companies or people with like political or wealth or privilege status
Mm,
that have influence over sort of what's rippling into like dominant society, but it's everyone. But
yeah.
that also means that information is not as regulated. I mean, it's not like it was really that regulated at all. But
Yeah.
wherever information is coming from, it's going to come with biases.
Mm,
And what that now means is that there's a whole lot of misinformation and projection and damaging content
mm.
across the board generally. I did just forget that we were talking about the positives. So I will I will just pull that back to say that this
I do love the nuance though. We said it would be nuanced.
It is this amazing way that, like I was saying, so many like body image activists and fat liberation individuals have been able to really scale their impact. Like
Mm.
without social media, a lot of these really positive messages actually just wouldn't even be in the periphery of so many people.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think all the way back to when I started talking about even like diet culture and anti-diet messaging, and I would talk about, how these bikini body challenge programs were putting on people on diets that a toddler needed, like the caloric
Mm.
intake of a toddler, and I would receive like death threats from their followers. Like it was in, and they were
Whoa.
like, this is so overblown, and this is, and all this like horrible, like just terrible language about people in larger bodies, etc. And then over the years, these people have come back and have been sort of awakened to things like intuitive eating, like fat acceptance movements, all that kind of stuff, where it's like without that presence online, without the presence of these very generous contributors who really do put their lived experience
Mm.
on the line when it's something that they, can obviously very much be maligned for, and they're generously educating people, it is making a difference. And as you say, it's not a narrative that would show up in like dominant media, and it just doesn't. And
Exactly.
even with the eating disorder experience and how various those representations are, that's the reason I couldn't accept the label of having an eating disorder when I was diagnosed, because I had only ever seen the stereotype in dominant media representation. I'd never seen anything other than like the one anorexia stereotype that I'm sure we're all too familiar with, because the media still wants to push that narrative all these years later. It
Yeah.
still hasn't cracked through that sort of bit of stigma, really. I mean, certain outlets are better than others, but social media has really moved that needle forward. Obviously, always with the caveat, we've always got more work to do. I understand that. I've been here for 10 years. I know what it's like for it to move at a snail pace, but trust me, things have changed
Mm.
drastically in a decade. Um, so yeah, absolutely. I think that even just the overall representation and visibility of the issue, because that's one of the reasons why I switched from talking about my experience into advocacy, was when I learned that eating disorders have the highest mortality rate and the lowest funding. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. Like not just I take that personally because I have an eating disorder. That's not right. I was like, that doesn't make sense. How can something with the highest mortality rate have the least funding? And it's because it just didn't have the amount of visibility that it has increasingly been able to have as an issue. And I think that's in large part because of social media. Because as I said, the media narrative hasn't changed. So that wasn't it.
Mm, I love that point you're making there about how social media was really this way for a lot of people to be really, really brave and put their experience forward as an attempt to break the status quo
Mm.
of like this is what people are seeing, and this is what recovery actually looks like. This is what having an eating disorder can actually look like. This is what it
Mm.
looks like to be in a different body, and even just to be a human with a body. These are all these different experiences. So I think in looking at it through that lens, it's so incredibly expansive, and the industry wouldn't be where it is today if it wasn't for social media.
Yes, absolutely. And what it feels like too, I think that that's where we've been able to shift it a lot with sort of
Yeah.
art, because obviously we're going to get into some of the negatives as far as some of those representations. But that's part of what was always important to me about my messaging, was like, this is a mental illness with physical symptoms. Let's talk about the mental illness. Like, let's talk about the experience of it. Let's talk about the internal
Mm,
experience of it, because I think that's where we can get people to understand why these things are so complex, why they're so hard to treat, why they deserve so much empathy and compassion. Whereas if we just talk about the surface stuff, then, we're really not getting to the core issue of how these things need to be addressed. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, I think that people putting forward their lived experience of like their internal world and what it feels like to have an eating disorder, what it sounds like in their head, what it does to their relationships, what it does to their sense of purpose and identity, has been huge in breaking that stigma away from just eat a burger, or this is just about vanity, or it's just about superficiality, or it's just about wanting to be thin, or it's just about, I mean, even just like the stats of different
Mm,
eating disorder experiences, and all the different subtypes, and the fact that then we've got disordered eating and people even further outside of that spectrum. I think it's done a lot
mm,
to really shatter the very, very hurtful, very surface kind of judgments that people have of eating disorders.
Yes, agree with everything that you're saying. I also think, you have to remember recovery is this really slow process.
Mm.
And to feel like you're doing it with other people as well, that even if it's virtually, that can be really, really motivating. And I also think, it's obvious sharing your experience is really powerful,
Mm.
particularly for people if they don't have someone in their everyday life who really understands what they're going through. It is going to be this natural human response to seek that elsewhere. And of course, social media is going to be the easiest way to do that.
Yeah, I felt like there's no possible way that someone's walking around feeling the way that I feel. There's just no way. There's
Yeah.
just no way that someone is possibly able to like navigate life, because I'm on the brink of not being able to navigate life like this. Like, how are people living like this? And I mean, our most recent stats show that since 2012, and I went into recovery in 2013, that we've now got 1.1 million Aussies suffering from eating disorders. And I think Butterfly said that was a 20, hang on, let me just verify this. So I went into recovery in 2013. And since 2012, there's been a 21% increase in eating disorders in Australia.
Those stats are actually just heartbreaking. Like
Mm-hmm.
they are so heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And so it's this real double-edged sword because there is a huge correlation between this more widely accessible information and then this increase of eating disorders. And of course, a lot of the recovery content is not the reason that eating disorders have increased, but just generally this access to social media and how that is being used
Yeah,
is a really big part of this picture.
totally. Yeah. Which I guess leads us into let's do it. I think we
Okay.
both know our notes are probably longer in this section than the other. What are some of the downsides or concerns about recovery content?
So I think even just to like preface this, I personally didn't recover like you in a time of influencer culture
Mm.
or actually really with diet culture, like you're saying, being prominent on a screen at all. When I recovered, I guess sort of there was less people were attempting to sort of make something of themselves. Maybe that's the wrong language, but you know what I mean,
I get it.
via the digital world.
Yeah.
So there was less space for misinformation and this sort of over saturation of digital noise. Like when I was recovering, or particularly when I was becoming unwell, diet culture was through like TV advertisements and magazines. It
Mhm.
wasn't living and breathing in your hand for 8 hours a day. It's a different world today. So I think to keep your wits in recovery, you need to be really digitally agile and have this real sharp like BS radar. But I also just acknowledge that the experience we're talking about now wasn't the experience that I was having when I was in recovery. So a lot of my concerns lie not with specifically with recovery content, but other content that is ultimately going to mix in with recovery specific content. A few
Yeah.
of these is diet culture being disguised as wellness culture. So to explore this a little bit, I think that this content is very much then sort of exacerbated with influencer culture, who are not only selling a like subtle diet, but they're selling wellness, right?
Mhm.
And the content I'm referring to, because it is not all wellness content by any means, but it's things that are very hyper body and nutrition focused, really with like a focus on clean eating and like aesthetic life focus, and will have this holistic swing on it.
Mm.
But everyone, restriction is still restriction, whether or not you're journaling about it at the same time.
Mhm.
But don't get me wrong, like holistic, it's my middle name. There's so much about the wellness world that I love. And I don't want to sit here and sound contradictory to that because there is a lot of really awesome things about wellness. So, like, these ideas of slow living and removing chemical toxicity, or really understanding that mindfulness can be a way of be a part of everyday life, or getting more sunlight, learning how to regulate your nervous system. I'm
Mm.
really here for all these things,
Mm.
but let's remember that for diet culture to be maintained, it needs money funneling through it.
Mhm.
That means it needs sales.
Yes.
So I think, in like today, 2024, people are probably a little bit more across of what traditional diet culture might look like, but it's a different thing when it's sort of selling like long-term health through wellness culture, because then it can be perceived as like healthy, not toxic. But I think it's so important for everyone to ask yourself, is this wellness culture that you are submerging yourself into actually just a reincarnation of diet culture that ultimately, guys, is nothing more than consumer culture, which is then fed through influencers as this marketing tool. Because really, like, let's remember the purpose of consumer culture is to sell you more and more by making you believe that who you are and what you have isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And just to put it straight, who you are is enough.
Mm.
And if being online is challenging that, something really has to shift.
Mm. Feel good?
I'm good. Exhale
better?
at the end of that. I do feel better, yes.
Yeah, I think, and it's, as you say, it's just same shit, different disguise, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like, what is it? Like you can roll shit and glitter, it's still shit. Like it's kind of like your eating disorder. I mean, there was a bit of content that I reacted to a couple of years ago that went off, which was Sarah's Day marketing her latest like shredding diet, and the whole advertisement was geared towards people with eating disorders. It was like, if you're the girl who wakes up every morning thinking about everything she ate the day before, if you're the girl who can't leave the gym, here's an exercise product which is just for you. And I was like, am I seeing, like, I've been around for a while, and this is the first time I've seen a wellness product that is purely like about movement and restriction, marketed towards the eating disorder population. And here's, I think, the reason why it's so important that, you and I have come at this from slightly different angles, where like I was looking more so at like, yes, recovery content, but I'm so glad that you've come from this angle. The reason it's so important to look at the crossover with like wellness culture, diet culture, and like how it's relevant to like the vulnerable population that we're talking about is because diet culture, fitness culture, like these fitspo people, these fitness influencers who used to be able to just be fat phobic, who used to just be able to be fear mongering, who used to sell us diets for toddlers without anyone blinking and send people like me death threats when I was like, guys, I don't think this is great. People have woken up. The words intuitive eating are more widespread. The understanding that health is much more nuanced than like body size is more widespread. These people cannot be as overt in all of their horrible mechanisms as they used to be. And so now they are infiltrating true messages of like well-being and co-opting a lot of the language and co-opting a lot of the messaging because they can't earn money the way that they used to, as blatantly as they used to. And I was so relieved a few years ago to be like, oh, wow, like they're really receding. And they weren't. They were just dressing their message up in something else that looked, like I said, like rolling shit in glitter, so that we couldn't identify it quite as quickly. And I was quite grateful to Sarah's Day for that reason, because it like woke me up and was like, oh, hang on, we still need to be on alert and teaching people social media literacy, obviously as well, but social media literacy and giving people that filter to look at the world through so that they're not just ingesting this stuff without questioning, because it is so easy to go from an eating disorder into a different variant that just looks better and more palatable and more ordered. It's just that it's a more socially accepted kind of disordered, which I say to people all the time when they're like, all this work just for recovery, Mia. And I'm like, mate, you have the potential to have a relationship with food and body that most people will never experience, because 99% of people at some point or another are breathing in these disordered fumes, and they will never see it. They'll never know that's what they're doing. They will spend the rest of their lives thinking self-acceptance and happiness is going to be in a jean size. If they can just get down X amount of kilos, they'll finally be happy. They'll finally be lovable. You don't have to have an eating disorder to believe that. So there is such a trap here potentially for people to go into sort of an obsession, whether it's like, as you say, clean eating or fitness or, a certain kind of like mode of eating or whatever, that's less able to be defined, but is keeping a lot of like the eating disorder root system alive.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you're saying here, because it's really content like this that ends up creating this like weird make-believe world through this like unconscious assimilation that this is what your life should be like, because
Yeah.
it's not only like a diet, it's also like looking real pretty. Kind of feels like it's like the package deal.
Completely. I think that that's where the danger lies, is that this whole concept of like, I'm just selling like an ebook, or like the fact that people are selling ebooks still, like how vintage. Love that for them. Love the throwback. But like that they're selling apps and they're selling this, and like that's it. It's like, no. If I go and look at any of your marketing or any of your social media, it's all of like the pink, champagne toned, perfect kids and perfect house and perfect holidays, and you are not just selling the product, you are selling your body as part of the marketing, which, hello, genetics, majority of that is down to genetics. There is no way of eating or moving that is going to change your genetics ever. There's no amount of surgery that's going to change your genetics ever. Um, it's the blurring of eat like this, look like me, so that you can also belong, be safe, be successful, be happy, be loved, because
Mm.
they so intentionally enmesh the marketing of their lives and what they want to put forth as who they are as a person and their body with this product, right? Like it's not maybe as flagrant as it used to be, but like think about like Ashley's bikini body challenge. Her body was the thing you apparently got as a result of this product. It's genetics. It's genetics. And
Mm.
people
Mm.
were absolutely destroying themselves and then getting to the end of that and ending up in a pretty, bad place, whether it was mentally or physically or falling off the bandwagon. And then they blame themselves, where it's like the product is the problem. Your body is not the problem. Your body's just fighting to get back to where it's supposed to be to keep you alive.
Totally.
Anyway, as we know, I have a lot of feelings about those things.
I like these feelings. These are good feelings to have. I think, my hope is that there's conversations like this that can kind of pull people out of just the blind reaction of being like, oh shit, why am I actually looking at this content? Because like you are being fed by osmosis all this crap.
Mm.
And like, can we just zoom out for a minute and actually just look at this stuff with fresh eyes? At this culture that is so ingrained, to see what it actually is. If someone had told me 5 years ago that the most trending thing online would be looking at what other people eat in a day, I would say no, it wouldn't be. Guys, is there genuinely nothing more interesting to absorb every single day?
Yes. Let me get into what I have to say about recovery content online. Let me be as clear as this. And I'm talking specifically about recovery content now, which I think has a crossover with what we just were talking about. Because what I find so disheartening is that all that stuff that you're talking about, this pretty packaging of recovery, of certain bodies, of being in the gym every day and saying that that's recovered or fully recovered, of like showing all of your food to your followers, the relevance of that is zero, because why do we need to see what everyone's eating every day? Why do we need to see in fine detail what someone's eating every day? Again, coming back to things like genetics, lifestyle, medical needs, all that sort of stuff. How can it possibly have any relevance to look at what anybody else is eating? But let me be this clear about I know I've sworn a little bit in this episode, but I don't care. What gives me the shits about recovery content, having been here for a decade? If you are someone who is posting what I eat in a day's before and after photos, hospital photos, numbers of any kind, lowest weights, current weights, calories, let me say this: you don't give a shit about your audience. We know enough now to know how invalidating, how unhelpful, and how damaging that information is. This isn't 10 years ago. This isn't a mystery anymore. If you see somebody posting that stuff, they are doing it to raise their own engagement, not to raise awareness. It infuriates
Mm.
me that people hide behind, I'm just sharing my experience, I'm just trying to raise awareness. Please don't use recovery from the most dangerous mental illness as like farming, as follower farming, because that's all it is. We've heard enough from the people in this space, from our
Mm.
followers. I've had them for
Mm.
10 years. The majority have said the same thing. These things are harmful. These things are invalidating. These things further a stigma that we are working so hard to break all the time.
Mm.
And the upholding of that stigma is coming from within our own community. And I'm over it.
Fantastic
Haven't been
rant.
that blunt in a while. Used to do that a bit more, but the idea that we don't know, I would have bought that about 8 or 9 years ago. We know now. We know now
Yes.
how harmful this is.
Yes.
Cut it out.
Yes. And just to good cop piggyback on that,
Sure, love it.
I I think a lot of people who are sharing this content, all those things that you just listed,
Mm.
a lot of them probably like there's not much malice here. They're not intentionally like I'm going to fuck up
No.
this person's recovery, but
No.
it's actually a huge, really expansive learning opportunity for so many people if you are doing this or if you've witnessed it. Because what happens for a lot of people when they get caught into diet cultures, like they've just like tagged on to what's that thing? What's that dance? You've tagged onto the conga line,
Yeah.
and then recovery, you're trying to tag onto this other conga line. But
Yes,
the thing about
validation.
this thing about recovery is that you are learning how to stand on your own 2 feet and create your own identity that often isn't what everyone else is doing, because it can't
Yes.
be. Just because what a lot of people are doing doesn't mean that it's good or it's healthy.
Mm.
Because if you are just, I actually understand people wanting to share their recovery journey. Like I get the intention behind it. But if you are so focused on like you're saying, like what's the word? Like the reach of it,
Yeah.
and you're looking at how many people and who has liked this, you care about the
Yes.
numbers. Likes is literally just another form of numerical validation. So it
Yes.
feels so counterintuitive to be engaging and putting so much emphasis into this thing that is directly opposing to the work you're trying to do in recovery. Like there's so many different ways that being online is sabotaging your own recovery. But also, if you're listening to this conversation, you're like, shit, I've okay, this is a real
the
hard.
octave drop. Shit.
I feel like it's also just can be a bit of a like, all right, mirror has been held up to me.
Yeah.
Because you just really have to remember that the people who are going to be looking at your content and receiving your content, they are probably this huge chunk of the population who are also really sensitive to trying to find evidence and reasoning to shapeshift their own attitudes and behaviors. Like they're so sensitive
Mhm.
to anything that you could be actually posting.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, I obviously also come from the school of thought that like we're responsible for our own triggers. I mean, again, that comes with nuance and gray area, right? Where it's like sometimes we are not cognitively even aware of what we're doing. Like when I was unwell, I would go to like pro eating disorder spaces, of which there are really none anymore. Thank goodness. They're really buried. They're hard to find. They weren't hard to find when I was unwell, right? I didn't contribute to them. I wasn't active. I didn't have an account, but I would go looking for ways to hurt myself. I would go looking for tips on how to exacerbate my eating disorder, but I didn't even think I had an eating disorder, right? Like this level of cognitive detachment and denial was so strong that if somebody had said to me, you have an eating disorder, I would have laughed. I would have been like, no, I don't. Even though I was actively engaging in things that were evidently an eating disorder, right? So I understand that there's levels of cognitive awareness and therefore locus of control, etc. But if you are at the stage where you are seeking out and engaging with recovery content, there is a level of awareness, right? There is a level of awareness whereby if you feel that you are not being benefited by something, or even if I always say you don't even have to feel bad or triggered, if you feel nothing when you look at content, stop looking at it, right? Why would you look at something that elicits absolutely no feeling, that doesn't make you feel educated, inspired, creative, curious? It doesn't make you laugh. It doesn't give you a little bit of relief in that day. It doesn't give you a little dopamine kick to see a bunch of puppies running around after each other, whatever, right? Of course, there is also the self-responsibility here. However, my issue is that, again, if we have all of these stigmas around what an eating disorder is and isn't, that yes, it's about the food, but it really isn't. Yes, it's about the body, but it really isn't. That we have all these stigmas about, an eating disorder is someone who goes to hospital, who goes to inpatient, who is in a certain kind of body. And that's what we're proliferating from within our own community, where we so desperately need people to understand the depth and complexity of these eating disorders. To contribute to the stigmatization of your own illness is like, come on, guys, like let's move this forward a little bit, right? And it also then, if there's a number of people doing it, then when people are going around looking at content, it normalizes it for the consumer as well, right? Like maybe this is what recovery is. Maybe this is what this
Mm,
process is. Maybe it is staying stuck in loops and cycles, and it is moving into fitness obsession, or it is, now showing my run every day, having run 10 miles and showing someone my Apple Watch and what exercise I've been up to. All of these iterations are just so unhelpful for everyone. And I, like you, mean that also for the person creating it. It is harmful for them as well because, and I think we've all kind of seen it, when you continue to pin your sense of self and identity on external validation, like likes, like clicks, it kind of incentivizes you to hold on to that eating disorder identity. If you've become known as this
mm,
person who speaks about this online, who has this following, who receives this validation this way, what happens to you when you're not that person anymore? What happens to you when you're not sharing this story anymore? Who are you? How do you see yourself? So I think all the way around the board, if you're thinking about sharing your recovery online, you need to think very, very carefully about why and how and for who. Because if it's really not for you to get to the part of the process that you need to get to, um, I think you've really got to question why you're doing it.
mm.
What's
Shit,
your
that's a
what's your
really good
motivator?
point. Really good point. I just to piggyback off that whole identity piece, if you feel like you're not willing to let go of your like recovery online identity, you're sure as hell not going to be ready to let go of like your eating disorder. Like
Bingo.
realistically, we're adding this whole nother layer of complexity to something like what is the point of trying to like pull apart the layers of or the eating disorder if it's literally just like little whack-a-mole situation, like here we go, we're doing it somewhere else.
Hmm.
It's such an interesting experience, I think, for these people online because like we were saying, like this is a new thing, like this is new territory, this stuff is changing like month to month so rapidly.
And it's
And if
exploded in the last couple of years. It's
yeah,
exploded. You're right. It is very recent.
yeah, it's incredibly recent. And I think another thing with a lot of this content that I'm seeing online that is really counterintuitive to eating disorder recovery is that there's sort of this like promotion of ideas about this like almost looks like it's like an easy way. There's this like single
Yes.
answer, allure of quick fix. And newsflash, there's no quick fixes in
Mhm.
recovery. So again, engaging with something that is directly opposing to your recovery, yeah, it's seriously got the capacity to take you off course or at least stagnate your forward momentum. If you're someone who kind of feels like I'm treading water in recovery and like I'm doing the work and I'm not really moving anywhere,
Mm,
let's have a bit of a look at your engagement online and what's actually going on there.
mm.
Because I think the thing is on social media, you witness so many lives, you witness so many people in recovery, you probably witness so many people who are like explicitly doing really disordered things. And particularly with recovery content or even like wellness content, seeing that is going to spark desire. Like, I want that.
Yes.
And often that I want that becomes, I want that now. But
Mm.
you can't skip the work of rebuilding your life and you can't rush your healing. There's going to be no easy button and there's not supposed to. I think it's sort of this like seduction of the easy.
Mm.
And if you have an eating disorder, I'm going to take a pretty educated guess that you could be super vulnerable to a lot of false promises. And
Yeah.
that's what a lot of this stuff you're seeing online actually is.
Yes, that, like we say, like if it looks too good to be true, it's probably a scam, and an eating disorder is a huge scam. So if recovery is looking easy or simple or pretty or and it can, like, don't get me wrong, we talk about how beautiful the recovery
Mm,
process can be, the little glimmers that show up along the way, the self-actualization, the connection to others, the connection to self, the ability to regulate, the ability to see life through a lens, totally. But I think we also provide the other side as well, which is like the reality that it is
mm,
a hard slog. It is ditto repeato. It is periods of just doing the thing, even though it doesn't feel good. By necessity, anything that's hard in life that's worth doing kind of comes down to that basic tenet that, like, you got to do some hard stuff before you start reaping the rewards of it, right? And that was always one of my core principles as well, was that not just sharing my recovery, but even once I was recovered, I made a commitment to like still share, to the extent that I was comfortable, the harder parts of my life. I never wanted it to be like my life now that I'm recovered is just like this glowing beacon of ease and happiness and self-confidence, and everything is, of course not, right? So I think that from the perspective of people who are out there, I mean, I think I've said enough about people who create the content, the people who are consuming it.
Mm.
It is, as I said, like some of that social media literacy in this area is so, so, so important. And I think what you just said really gets to the heart of it. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. If it appeases your eating disorder to look at that kind of recovery and go, oh, that kind of recovery looks okay. That kind of recovery, I think both my healthy self and eating disorder could get on board with. Your recovery should be something that your eating disorder could never agree to. Right? Like the things you need to be doing in recovery, your eating disorder shouldn't be cheering you on going, that looks great. Let's do that. Let's go for a 10-mile run every day. Like, of course not. Of course, it's not going to be happy about your recovery choices. And being able to, I think, first and foremost, as that first layer of entering that world, I always say, go as basic as following foundations and following trusted professionals, the kind of professionals' names that you hear a lot, because some of the stuff that we've talked about in this episode, unfortunately, I also see professionals in the space doing. Don't even get me started on my feelings on that. It'll be another hour and a lot more swearing. But there are also people in the professional space who do this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Content farming, kind of like farming. Anyway, following trusted professionals, following foundations as a first layer, as you're kind of navigating the space, that will then give you insight into what to look for. It will then make you more attuned to the red flags of things popping up where you go, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't look right. I don't think that's very recovery oriented. That looks too good to be true. That looks like something that actually appeals to my eating disorder and not my healthy self. That is bringing up comparison and competition. I think the two things that the kind of content that we're alluding to here, if it's looking at someone's content brings up comparison or competition, stop looking at it. It's
Totally.
like the number fixation. It's another transition in terms of how your eating disorder operates.
I agree with this all so much. I loved what you said before. Ditto repeato bingo. I feel like that's the newest
Did I say
slow
them
thing. I
all
was
in a
like,
row?
no, you didn't say bingo, but I've just
Oh.
added that to it, but it works very well.
Did I repeato? Bingo.
Me making notes while you're talking, that's what I write down. Ditto repeato.
I'm so insightful to listen to. Look at the notes people take about what I say. Ditto, repeato, bingo.
I made other notes as well, don't
Oh,
worry. Just on the comparison piece, like again in recovery, you were working so hard to find this strong sense of self, and then that to be the thing that really roots you in your life. You're not finding that online. And one of the ways in which you support yourself to do that is really developing these tools and skills to be able to handle comparison. So even just doing this generally, like in community, off the screen, it takes time and a lot of really careful experience to exposure. But when you're opening yourself up to the online world, nothing about that exposure is gentle or considered, and it's a lot harder to control. So if you know that you're someone who is really, like, you're in recovery and you're focused, but you know you're someone who's really easily triggered with comparison of someone else's recovery or body or like lifestyle or whatever it is, this is something to really look at. Like you were saying before, like your trigger's your problem. Yes, absolutely. But then also be aware that triggers aren't going to be rational. You could look at someone's like positive recovery content or negative recovery content or neutral recovery content. And dependent on the lens in which you're looking at that through, that's going to then determine your reaction to it. I would often have clients who message me and be like, I saw this and like this, I'm triggered by it in this way. And then it'll be the same conversation, be like, I'm triggered by this in that way. I'm like, so a little bit of evidence that this is not rational at all. So I think sometimes, just as you would in community, like say you're at the beach or at a shopping center or whatever, you're going to be like, hopefully your coach has told you we really need to be seeking body diversity. It's very fundamental, but also lifestyle diversity. Instagram is, like you were saying, a highlight reel after all. Whereas I think in real time, you can, more so get the full picture of someone's life as opposed to just the curated version. So for that reason, I feel like it's a bit easier to learn the skills to manage comparison off the screen as opposed to doing it on the screen. Like, don't just get triggered every single time you do it and then feel like you're 2 steps backward and you have to build up these skills again. And then you weren't prepared for the comparison online again. And like, we're repeating the same thing.
I think there was something that you said once, which was like, I think it was the Christmas episode where you said, don't expect to not get triggered. Like, you are going to get triggered. It's then how do you manage it, right? It's kind of like, I mean, I've had people who have come to my social media and said, well, Mia, it's easy for you to say this because you're in this body, or, like, of course you can say that because you didn't recover into a larger body, etc. And I think I've also mentioned this before where I say, I totally get that. I can't be everybody's representation. My question to you is like, what bodies are you looking at online and in your real life, right? Like, I can't be that representation for you. And if looking at my representation at the moment as someone who strives very much to not be irresponsible and not be triggering, if my content is triggering, that's okay. It's maybe I am not what you need right at this moment. And there are really great content creators out there, really fantastic content creators out there, and they just may not be for you, or they just may not be for you right now. That's where the self-responsibility thing comes in, where you're like, but this should be helpful. Don't should yourself. If it isn't, it's okay to like mute or unfollow or do whatever you need to do. A good example for me is like, I went through a period where if somebody posted their dad, I couldn't handle it. I couldn't look at it. Like, I couldn't follow any of my favorite like Good News or Upworthy accounts because they post cute dad content all the time. Now I can look at it and be like, I had a great dad. I'm so happy that other people have lovely dads. That's nice.
Mm.
But that I wasn't going to message them and be like, fuck you for having a dad. Mine's dead. Like, that would be so weird, right? Like, that's where the self-responsibility thing comes in. That's where the self-awareness piece of like, this is my thing. This is my process. This is my signal that I need to take care of. This is my alarm system going off. This isn't necessarily somebody else's responsibility. So it's a yes
Mm.
and thing. We've got two things that need to be happening. We need this space to be a lot more self-aware and a lot more responsible for the overall message that we're presenting as a whole. And the individual, we need to be teaching them not just, I think the social media literacy is there. I think it's the permission and the agency piece to
Mm.
implement whatever you need to. And that includes get all of this stuff off your feed if you need to. I do that with clients all the time, where it's like, let's go and look for things on social media which feed the part of you that have nothing to do with your eating disorder or recovery. Go and follow alpacas. Go and follow travel accounts that fire you up and inspire you to get to a part of the process where you can travel the
Mm.
world. Follow your favorite artists. Follow friends who don't face tune themselves. Because that's
Follow those really cute accounts of like the little toddlers slipping on ice. Like,
yes,
it genuinely
exactly.
gives me 3 hours of like laughing.
Dopamine on repeat, right? Um, there's so many positive uses. And here's the thing, like, I owe my whole career to social media. I am such a fan of social media in its best uses. I am so grateful for it, for my recovery, that I had people showing up in my comment section from the beginning being like, I'm a year ahead of you. I promise it's going to get easier. I'm 6 months
Mm.
down the process. I promise when you get here, what you're going through today is going to get easier. I know the beauty and the power of what this can be. But again, we've got to come back down to like each individual person and their needs and the nuance of what's going to serve them and what's going to benefit their recovery, which is why I'm glad we've kind of like covered quite a
Mm.
wide range of areas of this topic, because there is no one answer. There is no one creator that's for everyone. There is no one bit of content that's for everyone. There is no one approach that's for everyone. But I do think that there's some hard and fast rules in this area that
Yeah.
make a difference if people will pay attention.
Absolutely. I think just to sort of touch on the consumption of a lot of this content, I think, yes, despite the content and its sort of like a very addictive, influential nature, also think the actual act of using social media can be a form of avoidance. And,
Mm,
it is in itself this easy button away from discomfort. And a key part of recovery is learning to stay with what is uncomfortable without going into shutdown.
mm,
So I think, a lot of people sort of be like, oh, but it's healthy distraction. But I would challenge that, because it's not healthy distraction if you're not staying present and you're going into mind-numbing activity. I work with a lot of adolescents, and social media, particularly in that world, is a huge part of life. I mean, it's a big part of everyone's life, but particularly that age group. And for that reason, like eating disorder or not, like disordered eating or not, this is a thing that's going to be around for a long time.
Mm.
And it's probably, we're only going to have more and more generations that are using it to its full capacity. So it very much, like you were saying, it's this thing that it's so normalized. So really working on that digital literacy early is going to be really, really important. Just as ultimately you want to work towards having a healthy relationship with food, body, yourself, you also need to have a healthy relationship with how you're absorbing the external world, whether that's like people around you and the environments that you're in, but also how you're absorbing the online world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be really interesting to see how this space develops and grows. And like we're so fresh into like the social media world when you think about it, really, right? Like think about the top of this chat, like
That
8 or
scares
9
me.
years ago, Instagram was launched. It's been less than a decade, right? Like we don't yet know what the impact of this stuff is. We know from our own experience and from observing clients, like within this niche of recovery, like what it can be from a positive versus negative standpoint, but we're still learning so much, which is why I always advise people to exercise caution, whether you're consuming or you're creating. There are things even now, like I go back, sometimes my old videos will pop up and I'll watch it and I'll be like, and private, like, because you just don't know who you're going to be or where life's going to lead. So I can certainly speak from that creator standpoint to be incredibly discerning from that perspective, and as a consumer, be incredibly discerning. Use it for how it is powerful and good. And as you said, how it provides connection and inspiration and validation, to build up the awareness of what does serve you and what is, bringing your recovery forward. I hope that this episode can help to serve people to reflect from both perspectives, from both roles, because I think there's some really long overdue and that's why I know, before we started recording and I said, you said you have a lot of feelings. I said, I have a lot of feelings, and that I was going to be very direct, because I really think that these are long overdue conversations that people kind of tiptoe around. And they're conversations that we have to have, because it is that serious and that important. Eating disorders are incredibly serious. So this whole tiptoeing around, I don't think it serves anybody.
What did you say? Damn it. Ditto, repeato. No, ditto, bingo.
No, ditto, repeato, bingo.
But repeato just didn't really work
Oh,
in
so
the
I'm
context.
sorry.
So
I'm
I
sorry.
just had to edit it a little bit.
Ditto, bingo.
Ah.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
I think I've expressed all my thoughts, but the only other thing that I'm sort of sitting with is actually when you're sort of saying that, like, that there's so many different perspectives to look at this from, but then I'm thinking about my own engagement with social media and how that has sort of changed over time. Like, as a practitioner, I'm incredibly cautious, but I'm so cautious to the point that, like, I actually don't really have a social media presence.
I get it.
For that reason, because I think I'm so overly cautious
Mm.
about what I'm posting. And it's just this really interesting reflection. Like, I am pretty, like, I'm not really engaged in social media at all. Kind of like, personally, I have a private account that has nothing to do with my recovery world or anything. But even as a professional in the space, there's part of me that doesn't post because I'm also then have this additional awareness of, oh, I don't want to just be posting positive content and then someone feels like that's like unobtainable or like whatever it is. Which is, it's kind of really difficult because it's sort of like, I really want to post being like, yeah, like this is actually sort of like life beyond recovery.
Yeah.
But I also acknowledge I actually live in a really pretty place, and sometimes that might actually feel like it's not achievable to people. But then it's, again, for everyone to have that awareness that my life is not supposed to be your life. Your life is not supposed to look like my life. Your life is supposed to look like your life, but rather, as opposed to looking at what someone is just sharing via the screen, look at like, what is the feeling that you could get from that experience, maybe, as opposed to being like, my life needs to look exactly like this externally.
Exactly. And look, I am also aware, I will put this caveat on as well. I am aware that we're in an area where people can be very, very perfectionistic. They can be very, very black and white. It's why I put a disclaimer in my Instagram about 3 or 4 years ago saying, I hope that you'll find inspiration in my overall work, even if every post doesn't feel like it applies to you, because I think that we can get down into the minutiae and the detail of what people are posting and get to sort of, like, people have said to me, like, you only post the shiny, happy stuff. I'm like, are you kidding? Like, I've posted the most horrific things that have ever happened to me. What are you talking about? But where people are coming and looking at content through this lens, which is very much, feeding like a bias and feeding a confirmation
Yeah.
bias about their experience and what's not possible for them. And so if they see your life as shiny and perfect and wonderful, then it validates eating disorder, being like, well, you're never going to have that anyway, so don't even try.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's the thing, is it is a very, very nuanced conversation. It is yes, and it is the responsibility of creators, it is the responsibility of consumers, and I hope that we can continue to have honest conversations in this community, in this space, for the ultimate goal of keeping everyone, first and foremost, as safe as possible. And yes, then the next layer is, can we bring hope and awareness and education and inspiration? That's wonderful, but I think we've all got to get to like the baseline of safety first.
Absolutely. Safety being the most important thing in all parts of this conversation. Maybe what I'll do with my own Instagram is like not only share the pretty beach walks, but could also share when I lose my bikini top whilst being stung by a blue bottle. Like these things are happening as well. There's
Fantastic.
nothing perfect about any of this.
I love it. I will happily see that post. That will, I mean, that just doesn't sound very nice. That will make me laugh, and then I'll message you and be like, "You all right? Do you need me to
I'll be
send you
like,
dingoes?"
yes, I'm okay.
I'm sure this isn't going to be the last time we have this conversation. I'm sure we're going to have people with a lot of opinions. I would love to hear them. And as always, let us know your feedback. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about. I promise we'll be back much more routinely now that we have our amazing assistant Heather on board. And our sometimes fortnightly will hopefully be more just fortnightly.
Fortnightly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.